I'm using my friend's account because I don't want this traced back to me. My family situation has gotten really complicated, and I'm honestly at a loss. I've been with my wife Ellie since high school, and we've been married for 18 years now. She's been part of my family for half my life at this point. My family owns a vineyard that's been passed down for 4 generations. Sounds fancy, I know, but the reality is we're what you'd call asset-rich, cash-poor. The vineyard barely breaks even most years, but it's our family legacy and identity. Some background that's important to this whole mess. When I was 18 and my younger brother was 16, our dad just up and abandoned us. Completely ghosted his entire family. Left our mom to run the vineyard and raise 2 teenage boys alone. It was during this dark time that Ellie and her family stepped up in ways I still get emotional thinking about. They didn't give us money or anything. We were all broke, but they showed up day after day to help with harvests, brought food when mom couldn't get out of bed, helped us navigate all the paperwork and legal stuff. Ellie has been my rock through everything since then. Fast forward to now. James got married to Vanessa about a year ago after dating for only 14 months. Way too quick, in my opinion, but I kept that to myself. At first, everyone welcomed her with open arms. My mom was thrilled James had found someone. Ellie went out of her way to include Vanessa in everything, and I was just happy to see my brother happy. But over the past few months, things have gotten increasingly tense, and last night it all came to a head. We have these weekly family dinners at the main house where my mom still lives on the vineyard property. It's been a tradition forever, and it's usually pretty chill. Just food, wine, and catching up. Last night, I noticed Vanessa when my mom asked Ellie to help her prepare our harvest soup. This soup is important in our family. It's from a recipe that survived when my great-grandparents pretended to abandon winemaking, but kept everything going. While my mom and Ellie were in the kitchen, I saw Vanessa sitting in the dining room, watching them. It made me uncomfortable, but I figured it wasn't my place to say anything. When my mom called everyone to dinner and presented the soup, she explained the history behind it, as she does. Ellie was adding details because she's heard the story many times. I noticed Vanessa barely touched her bowl. Then about halfway through dinner, my mom mentioned how Ellie had helped maintain family traditions during our darkest time after Dad left. It wasn't meant as a comparison or slight. Mom was just expressing gratitude like she does. That's when Vanessa decided to speak up. So, when do I get to learn these precious family recipes, or is that privilege reserved for people who've been around longer? The silence that followed was very awkward. My mom looked confused and hurt. Of course you can learn them, dear. I thought you weren't interested in cooking when you declined my offer last month. I didn't even know Mom had offered to teach Vanessa family recipes. It was clear Vanessa had a different version of events in her head. Right, one invitation after 18 years of Ellie being the preferred daughter-in-law. I see how it works around here. I glanced at James, expecting him to say something, anything, to redirect his wife's increasingly bitter comments. But he just stared at his plate in silence. Ellie looked upset. Mom tried to salvage the evening by changing the subject to the upcoming harvest festival, but Vanessa kept making these pointed comments about established hierarchies and how new family members know exactly where they stand. I was getting seriously annoyed, but kept my mouth shut for Mom's sake. After dinner, James pulled me aside while we were walking through the vineyard, but his expression made it clear this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. You need to talk to Mom and Ellie about making more effort with Vanessa, he said. They're intentionally excluding her, and it's making her feel unwelcome. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Were we at the same dinner table? I reminded him how Vanessa had been the one making snide comments all evening, while Ellie and Mom had been nothing but welcoming. I also pointed out that Ellie's family had helped us keep the vineyard after our father abandoned us, and that maybe his wife should show a little more respect for the traditions that kept our family from falling apart. You always choose Ellie over blood family, he shot back, before walking away to where Vanessa was waiting by their car. That comment has been eating at me all day. Yes, I love my wife, and I'll always have her back, especially when someone is being cruel to her. But James is my only brother, and we've been through a lot together. I don't want to create a permanent rift. At the same time, I'm watching Vanessa cause a division between James and the rest of us, and it feels deliberate sometimes. I've seen this kind of thing play out with friends' relationships before. Someone slowly isolating their partner from family, Edit. To clarify, my mom has invited Vanessa to help with family traditions multiple times. She's offered to teach her the recipes, how to taste wine, even invited her to help with the harvest planning, which is a big honor in our family. Vanessa has either declined or shown minimal interest each time, then turns around and complains about being excluded. I'm stuck between defending my wife and mother who have done nothing wrong and potentially pushing my brother further away. The vineyard needs all hands on deck for harvest season coming up, and I'm worried this tension is going to make everything harder than it needs to be. I never thought I'd be in this position with my own brother, and I'm not sure what the right move is here. Now for the first update. I'm honestly blown away by all the responses to my post about the drama with my brother's wife at our family vineyard. As many of you suggested, things have gotten more complicated since I last posted, so here's what's happened in the past week. After that disastrous family dinner, I talked to Ellie about everything that went down. Turns out, she's actually been trying to include Vanessa way more than I even realized. She told me she had invited Vanessa to lunch 3 separate times over the past few months, specifically offering to teach her family recipes and vineyard traditions. Each time, Vanessa either declined outright or canceled last minute with some vague excuse, and then apparently turned around and complained about being excluded. Make it make sense. My mom called me the morning after that dinner. She kept asking if she had somehow made Vanessa feel unwelcome despite her efforts. It broke my heart listening to her blame herself when she's literally bent over backward trying to welcome Vanessa into the family. My mom is the least confrontational person ever and just wants everyone to get along, which makes her an easy target for someone like Vanessa, if I'm being honest. The timing of all this couldn't be worse because our annual harvest blessing ceremony was scheduled for this weekend. For those asking about our traditions, the blessing ceremony is a meaningful ritual where each family member adds a handful of soil to the first harvest basket while sharing hopes for the coming year. It's been done for generations, and it's really important to our family identity. James texted that he and Vanessa would be attending the ceremony. Just a short, "We'll be there. 2 p.m., right?" Which is so unlike him. He's been super distant lately, only communicating through these brief messages rather than our usual phone calls. We used to talk almost daily about vineyard stuff and life in general, but now it's difficult to get more than a one-sentence response from him. Later that day, my cousin called me and told me Vanessa had been complaining to extended family members about feeling systematically excluded from vineyard decisions and family traditions. Apparently, she's been telling people that my mom and Ellie have this weird codependent relationship that doesn't leave room for new family members, which is complete BS. My mom welcomed Vanessa with open arms from day one. The day of the harvest blessing ceremony arrived, and the tension was high. Not exactly the vibe you want for a family tradition that's supposed to be about gratitude and unity. Everyone gathered in a circle in the vineyard. In normal years, this ceremony is my favorite day of the entire season. We took turns with the ceremonial silver trowel that's been in our family for 4 generations, each adding soil to the basket and sharing our hopes. When it was Ellie's turn, she spoke about being grateful for family bonds that withstand hardship. My mom squeezed her hand. They've been through so much together, especially after my dad left. The whole time, Vanessa stood beside James. I caught her whispering something to James that made him shift and stare at the ground. When the trowel finally reached Vanessa, she didn't even pretend to participate. She just handed it to James, saying loudly, "I'll pass on the performative rituals, thanks." My uncle looked absolutely shocked. My mom tried to smooth things over by quickly continuing the ceremony, but the damage was done. Everyone felt it. During the celebration meal afterward, I overheard Vanessa telling my cousins that the whole ritual was cultish and that our family was living in the past instead of making the vineyard actually profitable. The worst moment came when my mom proudly served a special vintage we'd been saving for this occasion. As she explained it was from the last harvest before our father left, Vanessa cut her off with, "Maybe we should focus less on sad history and more on making new memories." I watched my mom set down the wine bottle, clearly wounded by how dismissive Vanessa was being about something so meaningful to her. After the ceremony, James cornered me by the old barrel room. He was angry. "Why can't your wife and mom make more effort with Vanessa?" he demanded. "They're deliberately making her feel like an outsider." I tried to keep my cool, as many of you advised in the comments, and explained that Vanessa had rejected multiple inclusion attempts and was disrespecting family traditions that are really important to our mom. I told him about the lunch invitations Ellie had extended that Vanessa had turned down. Instead of listening, James accused me of rewriting history to make Vanessa look bad. He said I was twisting things around and that Ellie had never genuinely tried to include Vanessa. When I started listing specific dates and occasions, he just walked away. That night, I got a long email from James that felt like it had Vanessa's fingerprints all over it. It said I had chosen sides against my own brother and that Vanessa was considering not attending future family events if she continued to be disrespected and marginalized. He used phrases like toxic family dynamics and emotional manipulation that my brother would never say in a million years. A quick note. Many commenters pointed out that Vanessa might be trying to isolate James from our family, and I hate to admit you might be right. The way she's systematically creating conflict and then using that conflict as justification to pull away from us feels very calculated. I haven't responded to the email yet. Part of me wants to fight back and defend my wife and mom, but another part worries that we'll just drive an even bigger wedge between me and my brother. The harvest season is approaching fast, and we've always needed all hands on deck for that. With things this fractured, I don't know how we're going to manage the vineyard work, let alone the emotional fallout. I'm trying to figure out if there's any way to salvage this situation without throwing Ellie and my mom under the bus, which I absolutely refuse to do. They've done nothing wrong here, except exist in a family that Vanessa seems determined to tear apart. I never expected strangers on the internet to provide such insightful advice about my family vineyard drama, but reading your comments has helped me feel less crazy in this situation. I'll update again after I decide how to respond to James's email and we see what happens with the upcoming harvest. Now for the second update. Update 2. You all were right, and things have gone from bad to worse with my brother and Vanessa. I truly appreciate everyone's advice on my last post. It's been helping me stay grounded while this whole vineyard situation implodes around me. It's been 2 weeks since that awful email from James. During this time, James and Vanessa have been noticeably absent from our weekly family dinners. Each time, they've texted last-minute excuses. First, it was work commitments, then not feeling well, and most recently, just something came up. Zero effort to even make it believable at this point. Our family dinners have become gatherings. My mom keeps setting a place for James out of habit, and then quietly removes it when he inevitably texts that they won't make it. She tries to maintain conversation, but everyone can sense the tension. Ellie has been amazing through all this, keeping things going and directing conversations to lighter topics whenever the mood gets too heavy. I seriously don't deserve her. Yesterday, my mom called me in tears. Apparently, James had called her with some ridiculous demands about restructuring future family events to give Vanessa more prominent roles. He specifically suggested that Ellie step back from traditions she's been part of for almost 20 years. My mom was devastated. She couldn't understand how James could ask her to sideline someone who's been like a daughter to her since I was 18. Who even is this person my brother has become? What's making this whole mess even more stressful is that we're facing our most critical harvest season in years. The vineyard barely breaks even most years. As many commenters accurately pointed out, family vineyards are more about legacy than profit, but this particular harvest could actually put us ahead financially for once. Harvest has always required every family member to pitch in for the labor-intensive work. We're already shorthanded, and losing James and Vanessa's help could seriously impact our output. Our vineyard accountant called me yesterday. James had been asking her about the process for selling his portion of the ownership. I nearly dropped the phone. Our grandfather made us promise on his deathbed that the property would always remain intact within the family. It's been the one unbreakable rule for generations. No matter what disagreements arise, the vineyard stays whole. I can still hear Grandpa's voice. This land is your blood and bones, boys. Never divide what took generations to build. After pacing around the house for hours and reading through all your comments about trying to communicate directly, thank you for that advice, by the way, I decided to reach out to James. I texted him asking if we could meet alone without Ellie or Vanessa, just brother to brother. I suggested our old fishing spot by the pond where we spent countless childhood hours hoping that talking in person would help. To my surprise, he agreed. We set up lunch for the following day. When I arrived at the pond behind the Eastern Vineyard section, James was already there sitting on the dock. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. He looked defensive and exhausted. I sat down beside him. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. The familiarity of the setting made the distance between us feel even more wrong. Finally, I asked him directly about selling his share. His reaction told me everything. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at the water and mumbled something about how Vanessa feels the vineyard is holding them back financially and that dividing the asset would let everyone move forward instead of living in the past. Her words coming out of his mouth, clear as day. When I mentioned our promise to Grandpa, James became very angry. "I was 17 when we made that promise," he shouted. "Am I supposed to prioritize a dying old man's wish over my marriage?" The conversation quickly deteriorated from there. James revealed that Vanessa wants to use the money from selling his share to move to the city, away from what she refers to as the problematic family dynamics of the vineyard. As he spoke, I could almost hear her coaching him on these phrases. I tried to stay calm, taking the advice many of you gave about not escalating, but eventually I lost my patience. I asked James if he remembered how close we came to losing everything when our father abandoned us, and how Ellie's family worked alongside us for months without compensation to save that year's harvest. James just waved his hand dismissively. "That was 20 years ago. Vanessa is tired of hearing about St. Ellie and her perfect family saving us. It makes her feel like she can never measure up." I was stunned into silence. The gratitude our family has always felt toward Ellie and her parents isn't about making anyone feel inferior. It's about acknowledging a genuine sacrifice that saved our livelihood at our darkest moment. Also, calling Ellie Saint Ellie was definitely Vanessa's phrasing, not my brother's. After some back and forth, James finally admitted that Vanessa had given him an ultimatum. Either they distance themselves from the vineyard and what she called my mother's unhealthy attachment to Ellie, or she would reconsider their marriage entirely. I drove home in a daze, hardly seeing the road. This wasn't just about jealousy or feeling excluded anymore. Vanessa seemed determined to separate James from both his family and our shared heritage. This was a method of isolation, just like many commenters warned about. I hate that you all were right about this. That evening, my mom called me sobbing. She'd received a text from James stating that neither he nor Vanessa would participate in the harvest or any family events until everyone acknowledged how they had mistreated and excluded Vanessa. My mom kept asking what she had done wrong, and I had no answers that wouldn't make her feel worse. Edit 45 p.m. I forgot to mention an important detail. When I got home from meeting James at the pond, I checked our family's trust documents. According to our lawyer, if James tries to force a sale of his portion, it would trigger a clause requiring first right of refusal for remaining family members. The problem is, none of us has the liquid capital to buy him out at market value. If we can't come up with the money, it could force a complete sale of the property. My grandfather never imagined one of his grandchildren would want out, I guess. We've spent the last few days continuing harvest preparations without James, trying to figure out how to cover the work he usually handles. Some cousins and neighbors have offered to help, but it's not the same. The vineyard always thrived because it was a true family operation. My mother has thrown herself into work, probably to avoid thinking about James. I caught her staring at old family photos in the barrel room yesterday, tracing James's face in a harvest picture from when he was just 16. She looked so lost and confused, unable to recognize the son who's now threatening everything she spent her life preserving. Ellie has been my rock through all of this, as many of you predicted she would be, but I can tell the situation is wearing on her too. She overheard my conversation with my mother about James's text, and later I found her crying in our bedroom. She feels responsible somehow, that her very existence in our family is the problem. I tried to reassure her that none of this is her fault, but Vanessa has successfully created a narrative where merely by being part of our family for the past 2 decades, Ellie is somehow the villain. I'm at a complete loss for what to do next. If James goes through with trying to sell his share, it could mean the end of everything our family has built over 4 generations. The vineyard represents our history and heritage and reflects our family's resilience through wars, prohibition, economic downturns, and personal tragedies. The harvest begins next week, with or without James and Vanessa. Part of me wants to make one last attempt to reach my brother before the division becomes irreparable, but I don't know if I'm just prolonging the inevitable. Any advice on salvaging family relationships when one person seems determined to ruin everything would be appreciated. Now for the final update. Final update. The Vineyard saga has finally reached its conclusion, and it's not what any of us expected. I want to thank everyone who's been following this wild ride and offering advice. You guys seriously kept me sane through one of the most stressful periods of my life. It's been almost 2 months since my last update, when I left off with that painfully awkward evening in the kitchen with Mom and Ellie after James confronted Vanessa in the barrel room. That night, none of us knew what to say. We just sat there drinking wine and occasionally sighing. Mom kept checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for a text from James that never came. The next morning, I woke up to approximately 50 missed calls from James. When I finally called him back, he sounded completely wrecked. Vanessa had apparently spent the entire drive home from the vineyard berating him about his betrayal and how he'd humiliated her in front of the family. According to James, she'd given him a final ultimatum. Either he proceed with selling his share of the vineyard or their marriage was over. James ended up staying at a motel that night, saying he needed space to think. I offered our guest room, but he declined. He wanted to be completely alone to figure things out. I couldn't blame him, honestly. The poor guy had basically been manipulated for months, and he was finally seeing it clearly. Over the next few days, things got exponentially worse. Vanessa started posting these bizarre, passive-aggressive rants on social media about toxic family businesses and manipulative in-laws, without naming names, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. She even joined some online group for victims of family business trauma, which apparently is a real thing. The real bombshell dropped about a week later. James called me on a Tuesday night, sounding more like himself than he had in months. He asked if we could meet at the vineyard the next day. He had something important to discuss with the whole family. When I asked if Vanessa would be joining, he just said, no, she won't be part of this conversation. The next morning, we all gathered in the main house. Me, Ellie, Mom, and our vineyard manager Pablo. When James walked in, he looked exhausted and relieved. He sat down at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of family meals and pushed a folder across to Mom. I'm not selling my share, he said simply, and I've filed for divorce. Mom burst into tears. The folder contained paperwork recommitting his portion of the vineyard to the family trust with even stronger legal protections than before. He'd apparently spent the past week with our family attorney, creating documents that would prevent any future claims against his ownership share. Over coffee, James finally told us the full story of what had been happening behind the scenes. Apparently, Vanessa had been plotting to convince James to sell his share practically since they got engaged. She'd never had any interest in the vineyard or family traditions. She'd just seen dollar signs. She'd been telling her friends that marrying James was her retirement plan because of the vineyard's property value, not knowing we're basically breaking even most years. The most shocking part? She'd already been in talks with a luxury resort developer who was interested in the land. She'd actually given them tours of the property during harvest preparations, posing as a co-owner and discussing potential building sites. James discovered this when he found architectural mock-ups on her laptop labeled Future Vineyard Resort, dated months before she ever started complaining about feeling excluded from family traditions. Everything suddenly made sense. Vanessa's intense dislike of Ellie wasn't just jealousy over family connections. She saw Ellie as the biggest obstacle to her plan because of Ellie's deep commitment to preserving the vineyard. The whole feeling excluded narrative was just her way of driving wedges between family members to weaken our unified front against selling. James looked broken as he admitted all this. For months, she'd been feeding him carefully crafted stories about being mistreated, all while secretly planning to eventually convince him to cash out. She deliberately avoided learning traditions or recipes because she never intended to be part of preserving them. She wanted the land value, not the legacy. The real catalyst for James finally seeing through her manipulation came after that confrontation in the barrel room. When they got home, she'd accidentally let slip something about resort amenities during their argument. When James questioned her, she panicked and claimed he'd misheard, but it made him suspicious enough to start digging through her emails. That's when he found everything: the developer contacts, the site plans, even a draft announcement about the future luxury Vineyard resort with their names as visionary founders. "I felt like such an idiot," James said. "She never loved me or this place. She just saw a way to cash in on generations of our family's work." We spent the whole day talking, really talking, for the first time in months. James apologized repeatedly to Ellie for the terrible things Vanessa had said about her and for not defending her when he should have. Mom just kept hugging him randomly throughout the conversation. Now here's where karma enters the story. Vanessa apparently didn't take the divorce news well. She showed up at the Vineyard unannounced the next day, right in the middle of a tour with our best distributors. She was screaming about being cheated out of her investment and demanding her fair share of the Vineyard's value. Our distributors were absolutely horrified by her behavior. A representative from the developer she'd been talking to was also there, considering our wines for their other properties. He recognized her immediately and was visibly confused about why she was acting like a spurned partner rather than the co-owner she'd been presenting herself as in their meetings. In front of everyone, the developer asked, "Miss Mitchell, is there a problem with our proposed purchase agreement?" Vanessa realized she'd just been caught in her elaborate lie in front of multiple witnesses. James, who had been helping with the tour, just stared at her and said, "What purchase agreement?" The developer looked between them, clearly piecing together that he'd been misled about her ownership status. She stormed out, but the damage was done. Not only had she publicly exposed her scheme, but she'd done it in front of business associates who witnessed her claiming ownership of property that wasn't hers, which our lawyer later explained could potentially be considered attempted fraud. The divorce proceedings are moving quickly. Turns out judges don't look favorably on spouses who attempt to secretly sell property they don't own. James has moved back into his old room at the main house temporarily while he figures out next steps. He's thrown himself back into Vineyard work with a passion. As for the Vineyard itself, we've actually had a surprise blessing from this whole mess. The distributor who witnessed Vanessa's meltdown was so impressed with how our family handled the situation that he offered us an exclusive contract that will finally put the business on solid financial footing. He said he'd never seen such dedication to preserving a family legacy, and that's exactly the kind of story that sells wine in today's market. Mom is back to her old self. Ellie has been amazing through all of this, as she always is, never once saying, "I told you so," even though she absolutely could have. She and James have slowly been rebuilding their relationship, bonding over old Vineyard stories and shared memories. Last night, we had our first complete family dinner in months. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of gratitude for what we'd managed to preserve. James raised his glass for a toast, simply saying, "To family and to never taking it for granted again." I noticed Mom wiping away tears. Edit. Quick update. I forgot to mention that Vanessa apparently tried to launch a competing Vineyard experience business using her inside knowledge of our operations. She approached several of our neighboring vineyards with a business plan that suspiciously mirrored ours. Unfortunately for her, the wine community in our region is tight-knit, and word traveled fast. She's essentially been blacklisted by every vineyard within a 100-mile radius. James got a good laugh out of that one. Life after Vanessa has been surprisingly peaceful. The vineyard that's weathered 4 generations of challenges has survived one more storm, and somehow we've come out stronger on the other side.